This conference will now be recorded.
Well, hello. My name is Jeffrey Davidson, and I'd like to welcome you to the Boonsboro Tree Care Seminar. This seminar is sponsored by the Boonsboro Tree Board, and I will share about a little bit about the tree board in just a couple slides. But real quick, just wanted to share about myself. I am a resident of Boonsboro, and I am currently on the Boonsboro Park Board as well as the chairperson for the tree board here in Boonsboro. A little bit about my background. I actually have a bachelor's in forestry resource management, as well as an associate's in urban forestry. And I've currently worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service. And I will say that trees are one of my passions. So I'm really excited to share with you a lot of information about tree care. Our agenda for this presentation, we are going to cover 7 different topics. First, I'm going to share about what the tree board is. Then we're going to discuss some different benefits of having trees and what trees can do for us. We're going to talk about tree selection and planting. And then we'll talk about tree health, because once we have trees in our yard or in our area, we want to keep them healthy. We will also discuss proper pruning techniques. There's definitely correct ways to prune our trees and ways that as well as ways that we can prune and actually injure our trees. We're going to cover some common pest diseases and their basic control. And finally, we're going to end this presentation talking about who to call and when you should call. So to start off, what is the tree board? What's Boonsboro's tree board all about? Well, it actually started in 2014 as a subcommittee of the Park Board and the Environmental Commission. It's made up of their members of those 2 commissions, and it's all volunteers. We have changed it a little bit now to where we will have additional members that can join our tree board, but the one stipulation is you have to be a resident inside the town limits of Boonsboro. You have to have an interest in Boonsboro's urban forest and public ecosystem. The majority of the work that we do, pretty much all the work we do, is on public land. So that's covering mostly Schaefer Park and other property owned by the town of Boonsboro. The meetings that we hold are quarterly, and they're focused, as I mentioned, on the urban forest, on public lands, as well as education, trying to help others understand what trees can do for the community and their benefits. So some of the highlights that we've done since Boonsboro's founded a tree board, the biggest one is the town of Boonsboro has successfully become a Tree City USA, which is a really big deal. It's a national recognition of the fact that Boonsboro loves our trees and that we're willing to put money and invest into the trees in our parks and on our public lands to show that to help they remain healthy for many generations to come. And one thing Boonsboro has done is a lot of reforestation and planting of trees. We're trying to continue to build that ecosystem and that urban forest cover within our public lands. We also hold an annual Arbor Day celebration, and we've done children's Arbor Day presentations at the Boonsboro Library in the past. We have tree identification signs posted on many of the trees in Schaefer Park, as well as assisting the town in various landscape, arboriculture, and pest control projects and answering questions for the community. So the tree board is it's a dedicated group of volunteers that we're here to help. And I would highly recommend, as I'm going to mention at the end of the presentation, if you live in the town of Boonsboro, or even if you don't, feel free to reach out to Town Hall with your question, and they'll probably funnel it eventually to me, and I'll be able to follow up and help you out. So I'm going to cover just a little bit about some of the different benefits of trees. Trees have many benefits of what they can do for us and our community. First off, when we'll look at social and communal benefits. So for the social benefits, we all like to have trees outside our home and look out and see things green, ideally. We live in Western Maryland, so seeing the trees on the mountain is something that I would imagine most folks here really enjoy. They provide an opportunity of having a calmness when you actually go out into the forest. A lot of times you can feel a sense of peace coming over you. And you can experience that in your yard as well. If you walk under a large tree that's fully leafed out during the summer, you're gonna probably feel a little bit more calmer than you did versus standing on your driveway. As far as communal benefits, trees within our community are great because they can actually help as a little bit of a barrier, visual barriers between residences. Um, there's nothing better than looking out your window and seeing maybe a row of trees versus your neighbor's backyard sometimes. That can be a huge benefit to have a little bit more peace and quiet. And they also act, especially in the communal benefits, as sound suppressors. So the more trees you have around your home, the quieter your yard is going to be, the less road noise you're actually going to have. So that's another benefit that we really can derive from trees. As far as environmental benefits, trees, especially around more urban and industrial areas, trees help remove the carbon dioxide from the air. That's part of their photosynthesis. And their root system is also excellent at taking up stormwater runoff during heavy rains. The trees are great absorbers of runoff. They will help reduce the amount of runoff that's going into our sewage and drainage systems in our community, as well as filtering that water for us. And it's one less thing we have to worry about. As far as wildlife benefits, I think we've all seen probably plenty of these as far as squirrels, birds nesting in the trees. The deer will actually feed on acorns. It's nothing better than seeing some deer run through your property sometimes, seeing that especially in the winter. And as far as economic benefits, having mature trees in your yard will actually add value to your home. Now, the reverse is true as well, is if you have trees in your yard that are in poor shape or hazard trees, that's, and especially if you're trying to sell your home, that's actually something you're going to probably want to take care of ahead of time, because folks are going to see that and that they don't really want to have that risk of moving into a situation that may be of hazard. But as far as the economical benefits of trees, they substantially add to the curb appeal and to the value of your home. So there's something to keep in mind about making sure you maintain your trees and keeping them healthy. So I want to switch gears a little bit now and talk about tree selection. Um, Selecting the right tree for the right place in your yard is critical. Having the wrong tree in the wrong spot can really um, be a hazard, or it can cause a situation that you really don't want to have to deal with down the road. So there's a lot that you want to think about, especially if you're planting trees on your property. Some of the things that go into making sure you select the right tree for the right place is, first off, the shape and size. Um, if it's going to be close to your house, you may not want to have that huge oak tree. You may want to have more of a flowering redbud or dogwood or a fringe tree. The problem with having a large tree close to your house is, as that tree matures, you're going to be dealing with the limbs as they shoot over the roof of your home. And it's best not to have that, because during a storm we don't want to have any sort of the opportunity to have breakage or damage of the tree falling on your house. And there's also different shapes of trees as well. Do you want a pine tree that's going to have more of a cone shape? Do you want that oak tree that's going to have more of that round shape? So that's something to kind of think about when you're looking at trees. And the next bullet I have there is purpose. And identifying the purpose of the tree is again, that's extremely important. So the question is, why are you getting a tree? Do you want something just pretty to look at? Are you looking for a tree that's going to grow fast? Are you looking for a tree that's going to become very large and provide lots of shade, say over a patio or a deck eventually? Do you want a tree that's going to produce fruit? Fruit trees, apple trees, peaches, cherry trees, um, those are also desirable. So perhaps you want to have a tree that's going to produce something that you can consume. Um, So having that idea of purpose of why you want this tree versus just going out and buying any old tree you see is something that you want to think about, as well as looking at the size and the shape. The next thing there is looking at the soil and the drainage. Where is this tree going to be planted? Is it being planted in a rich, uh, moist clay loam soil that's dark and dark brown, that's going to have really rich nutrients? Or are you planting it in a real rocky soil that may have high clay content? Specific trees are going to do better in specific areas. And the last bullet I have there is the climate zone. That's referring to the picture on the top there of the United States with the different zones. That's something you want to be aware of as well. You're pretty safe. It's a pretty safe bet if you're going to go buy a tree somewhere in the tri-state area that it's probably going to do well here, because most trees, most nurseries especially, are going to sell trees that are adaptive to this our climate. Um, but what you want to avoid is if you go, say if you went on vacation down south to Georgia, Florida, or something like that. And well, actually, we could just say you're in Florida and you purchased one of those orange trees and tried to bring it back and plant it here in Maryland. It's not going to make it. It's too cold during the winter for a lot of those southern species, oranges, southern magnolias, things along those lines. So that's something you want to kind of check on, especially when you're looking at your tree type. You can kind of research online where it grows best. So we're going to kind of logically move through this process as we're talking about trees. And, you know, theoretically, you've decided on a tree that you're going to plant in your yard. The next question is, we want to go look for that tree. Now, as far as tree planting, you have a couple different options when you're going out to the nursery or if you're looking online of how you're going to receive that tree. And I want to talk briefly about the three main options of how homeowners can buy a tree and plant it and how it's going to come to you. The first one I kind of want to share about is these bare root seedlings. So bare root seedlings are more common when you're buying really small trees that are only going to be maybe 1 to 2, sometimes 3 years old. These trees are grown in a field, relatively planted kind of like you would see soybeans or corn. They're real close together. Um, and they're harvested. When they're harvested, they actually have a machine that goes underneath and gently lifts them up from the bottom so that the roots will just kind of come out of the soil. And what's going to happen, they call it a bare root seedling because the roots are bare. They're exposed to the environment, and you're going to be planting that tree just as you see it in this picture. When you're looking at bare root seedlings, you want to make sure that the roots are going to be moist and fibrous. If the roots are dried out or brittle, the tree's already dead. It's not going to live. And ideally, deciduous seedlings should have the roots about equal to the stem length. So the roots on these bare root seedlings are going to be pretty long. On conifer trees, your oak, or excuse me, your white pines or your Norway spruce or your blue spruces, the roots will be a little bit more fibrous and probably a little bit smaller. But this is buying bare root seedlings, especially if you're going to plant a lot of trees, and I'm going to say probably 20 plus is the best way to do it because they're going to be relatively inexpensive. But the downside, they're not going to be very big, so they're going to take a little while to grow on you. The next style that you're going to see is called balled and burlap trees. Now, these are your big trees that you're going to be receiving. These root balls can weigh upwards to 500 pounds, and the trees themselves can cost upwards of $5, $6, up to $1,000, depending on the species and the size of the balled and burlap root ball. These are typically going to be delivered and planted excuse me, by a nursery because of their size. It's a big investment and you want to make sure it's done correctly. When you're looking at these trees can get anywhere from 10 feet, sometimes up to 20 feet tall. So if you're looking to have a tree that's basically going to be put into your yard and already have that wow factor, that's what you're going to look for, is a balled and burlap tree. The root balls ideally, the root ball in these should be relatively firm when you touch them. That's why they have the wire cage, as you can see in the photograph. It's going to keep the root ball tight and firm and together. And the root ball should have an adequate size for the height and diameter of the tree. What they mean by that is obviously the bigger the tree on the top of you're going to see from the ground up, the root ball is going to get larger as well. And that, again, that's where you're going to run into situations where sometimes these root balls can weigh upwards to 500 plus pounds. The last option you typically will see is the most common for homeowners, and these are the container grown trees. These are the type of trees you're going to find at Lowe's or Home Depot, sometimes even discount stores such as Aldi's or Lidl's. They're grown typically as a bare root seedling, and usually about 1 or 2 years of age, they're transplanted into a container. Container grown trees are excellent. They're affordable. They're easy to move. You don't have to worry about the root ball falling apart on you typically because it's already inside that container. But when you look at these trees, you do want to make sure that the tree is firmly standing upright in that container. The root ball isn't loose. There shouldn't be any sort of wiggle. Ideally, if you tip the tree a little bit to one side or another, the container should kind of move with it. Now, the downside of these container grown trees are that they can contain what's called circling or girdling roots. So what happens is as the tree grows in the container, the roots are constantly growing out. But they're going to hit that plastic of the container, and then they're going to turn and begin to circle around and grow inside that container. Now, when you plant this tree, we're going to watch a video here in just a little bit about how to plant a containerized tree. You want to make sure that those circling roots that you're going to identify when you take that tree out of the container are cut or broken free and made straight as possible. What can happen is if you don't do that, as the tree is in the ground growing, those circling roots are already trained to grow in a circular pattern, and they're going to continue to grow like that. And the tree will grow up to a certain point, and eventually those roots are going to continue to grow in mass, and it's going to create a giant root ball that's basically going to strangle itself. So that's one of the things you want to watch out for when you're planting a containerized tree. So as you can see there for the second bullet under containerized grown trees, you want to prune those roots. You want to cut them nice and clean. Ideally, the roots should be no more than a finger width in size, and you want to make sure that girdling tradition, that girdling side effect of being grown in a container isn't going to affect the tree down the road. And again, the last bullet there, the soil and the roots should be joined tightly together. And that's kind of where I talked about being able to tip the tree a little bit, and the container should move with it one direction or another. It shouldn't just be loose inside the pot. Again, here's just this last photograph. Last diagram is just kind of putting the three different options side by side. Again, you have the bare root seedling. Again, those are going to be your small trees. If you're going to do some reforestation or you're looking to plant, 20, 30, 40, 50 trees in your backyard, I would highly recommend the most cost-effective way to do it is these bare root seedlings. If you're going to go for a showpiece in your front yard that you want to have 15 feet tall right from the get-go, then you're going to want to go with a balled and burlap tree. But I would highly recommend you seek professional help in getting it planted, depending on the size. Then the other option, which is the most common for homeowners, is that containerized tree. All right. We're going to watch a video here about how to plant a tree now. Here we go. All right, and that's a good video to kind of see how to plant the containerized tree. So to kind of summarize a little bit about tree planting in general, we're going to kind of just go through the steps. So first and foremost, when you're planting a tree, you want to decide where you want to plant it and mark that area. And then kind of take a look at the tree that you're planting and make sure that it really kind of fits in that area as far as the size, the shape. It's going to have, you know, whatever that tree is going to do is exactly what you want in that specific area. I'm going to highly recommend, especially if it's in your yard, to call 811, which is the Miss Utility. They have a website, which is call811.com. Miss Utility will come out for free. I think they would like to have at least a few days notice, but just to make sure that there's no water lines or power or anything under the area that you're looking to put your tree in. The last thing you want to do is begin digging a hole and all of a sudden by accident, you know, cut an electric line, hit a water line or something like that, especially spending the amount of effort that it takes to go into planting that tree. You want to make sure that you're good to go right from the bat. So highly recommend contacting Miss Utility. The next thing you want to do is measure that root ball. If it's a containerized tree, you want to measure the diameter of the container and how deep it is. Because ideally, once you begin to prepare that hole that the tree is going to go into, you want to have a rough idea how big the hole's got to be. It's normally recommended to have the hole anywhere from 2 to 3 times as wide as the diameter of the root ball. You know, that's not written in stone, but the reason for that is it allows the roots to have a little bit of looser soil to kind of get settled into. A lot of times, especially here in Western Maryland, a lot of our soil can be really hard and clay packed. So kind of giving the tree that little bit of a head start to kind of be able to grow into some looser soil will really pay dividends in a couple of years and get the tree established really well. You want to put the tree in the ground gently, and you want to get the tree in position. You want to have that tree standing perfectly vertical. Sometimes you might want to bring out a level just to make sure the tree is vertical, because if it's on a hillside, it may look straight up and down one direction, but if you miss the other way, you're going to realize that you're going to have to replant it, and that's not what you want to do. Once you have the tree in the hole, you want to begin to backfill the soil. I always recommend that you fill at least halfway around the base of the tree, tamp that soil in with your shovel and your foot, and then get a watering hose or a bucket of water and kind of just give that halfway up soil a rinse. Get it wet, and what the reason for that is it's going to get rid of any air pockets, like any large air pockets, especially around the root ball. And it's going to really help settle that soil around the root ball. And then finish backfilling in the hole. You don't want to fill the hole any higher than the root flare of the tree, and then water it in one more time. and you want to make sure that everything is nice and settled. Ideally, if you have the opportunity, go ahead and get some stakes, put some stakes around the tree, drive those in. You can then use some, ideally some like nylon strap or something, or chain lock or something that's you can use to kind of secure the trunk. The purpose of the stakes is mainly to, as wind comes, it's going to kind of blow the tree, and the stakes will help keep that tree more or less centered to allow the roots to grow into the soil to begin to become that anchor for the tree. Without the stakes, if the tree has too much wiggle, the roots will really never set in. And again, the more wiggle that the root ball is going through, especially in the wind, the roots may just determine, they're going to grow relatively slow, or every time they grow, they may break off, because those real first roots that are going to grow out are going to be very, very small root hairs. So staking it is highly recommended. Again, water the tree, and finally at the end, you want to put some mulch on the tree. Now there's there's a common way and a correct way, I'm going to say, to put mulch on your tree. You'll see in this photograph, the base of the tree, the mulch is the brown. So there's what they call the mulch volcano. That's bad. You don't want to do that. And basically what you're doing is you're just piling the mulch up around the trunk of the tree. The reason you don't want to do this is because that root flare that we saw on the bottom needs to be exposed. It needs to be exposed to the air, and to allow the tree to kind of, allow air movement through there, so you don't get any sort of rot or anything like that setting in. The problem with the mulch volcano is covering up that root flare is going to introduce moisture where the tree does not want moisture. The bark will slowly begin to deteriorate, and you end up with an opportunity for fungi to kind of invade that tree and begin to cause more of a rot at the base of the tree. And there's also certain mice and things like that will sometimes kind of burrow into the mulch, and they'll start nibbling on the base of the tree as well. The proper mulching example, as you can see there, the root flare is exposed, and you have about, I kind of refer to it as a donut running around the base of the tree of mulch. Typically, it can be as wide as the flare, wide as the root ball, or the diameter of the hole that you planted. And you want to kind of have that donut about maybe 3 inches tall at the deepest spot. And that's going to provide excellent coverage. It's going to, the donut of mulch will control the weeds surrounding the tree, and it'll also act as an insulation blanket. So that way, as you water the tree, it's going to prohibit the water in the soil from evaporating quickly. So that's the best way to do proper mulching, is right there. So again, kind of talking about trees here, I want to talk a little bit about basic tree anatomy. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I think it's important to know just some basics. And what I really want to kind of highlight in this slide is really what's under the ground. I think everybody's more familiar with what's above the ground as far as the branches, the leaves, the crown of the tree, etc. But the part under the ground is often taken for granted. There you have that taproot and those lateral roots. And one thing that's of interest, a lot of people aren't aware of, is I think it's anywhere from like 80 to 90% of the tree's roots are really only about a foot to 2 feet below the soil. That picture of a taproot going way down deep into the soil really isn't all of that. Some trees, hickories, for example, will have real long taproots, maybe extending down 10 feet into the soil. But a lot of them have those lateral roots that run horizontally just under the surface of the tree, kind of out to the crown line. A lot of the roots, this picture does kind of show it correctly. Those lateral roots will run the entire distance of what the canopy of the tree is. So think about that, especially when you're around parking lots and seeing trees in small little areas that are planted. They're doing all they can to survive because their roots are really covered up by a lot of concrete or asphalt. So they're kind of struggling probably a lot of times. Um, but it's important to know, and especially when watering trees, especially larger trees in the summer. If we have a really dry summer, it doesn't hurt to give your large trees a drink. And you can do it close to the trunk, but you can also turn the hose on real slow and just kind of move it around underneath the canopy of the tree, and you're going to hit all of those lateral roots, and the tree will thank you for that. Internally, in a tree, when you cut a tree and you look at a cookie, or it could be just a log, um, there's a couple different parts in here I want to point out as well. The heartwood is in the center of the tree. The heartwood is the oldest wood, and as a tree grows, it increases in size each and every year. That's why we see those growth rings. But the purpose of the heartwood is to support the tree. That's tissue that is no longer functioning as far as moving any sort of fluid or moisture up and down through the tree. Its sole purpose is to keep that tree upright and for support. As you move out from the middle of the tree, out of the heartwood, you'll run into the sapwood. And in the sapwood, you will see water moving up and down. It's usually a little bit lighter in color. A lot of times it's not as thick as what this diagram is showing. Say if you had a 12-inch diameter tree, maybe 1 inch from the bark is where you're going to find that sapwood. It's not that thick. The heartwood takes up probably 90% of that. But as moving out towards the bark from the sapwood, then you run into the cambium and the phloem. That's actually the part of the tree that's actually where everything's happening. That's the living part that's actually growing. And it's just underneath the inner bark, which is followed by the outer bark. And the reason I want to kind of point this out is we often talk about, it's easy to strangle a tree, especially if you have a young tree and you put stakes in the ground and you put some ties around it to support it. I see this all the time, to where if you don't remove those ties, the tree is growing and getting larger and larger and larger and larger. But if the wire around it does not allow does not move, the tree is going to eventually grow. It's going to cut it off. It's going to grow. The tree is going to try to grow around it, but a lot of times what happens is the tree is going to eventually basically strangle itself, because that cambium layer is relatively small. It doesn't take a whole lot for that to happen. And the other thing I wanted to mention too is if you have a bonfire or fires close to trees, you can see how close that cambium and phloem layer is to the surface. If it gets too hot, you may not be burning the bark of the tree, but if it gets too hot, especially from a fire source, it can kill those cells and thereby injuring the tree quite a bit. All right, we're going to move on to tree health. And what I want to kind of talk about here about tree health is that first question I have on the slide is, do you know what your tree should look like when it's healthy? That's really an important thing to know. I've heard that when this, for an analogy, people when they for the U.S. Treasury, when they're training people to be able to determine when something is counterfeit, they don't train them on looking at all the different types of counterfeit money that's out there in the world. They actually train them on looking at the real thing, what it's supposed to be, what it's supposed to feel like, what are all the details that should be there. And I would use that same philosophy on determining tree health. You really want to know what a healthy tree, say if you have an oak tree, should look like in your yard. And that's going to help you be able to determine if something's off or something's not quite right. And as we kind of look at that, you want to know, what should I look at? Well, I would usually recommend you kind of start from the top and work your way down. If you know your tree is supposed to have a nice round form with beautiful green leaves, as far as being a healthy tree, but you're looking at your backyard, looking at your off your back deck, and you see a tree that for some reason, as you can see in this example, one side of the tree is looking a little sparse. That's a flag. There's something going on there. And that's what kind of says, okay, I don't think my tree's as healthy as I thought it was. That's something you want to maybe look into and explore a little bit more. And then on top of that, you kind of want to look around your area at the other trees and plants. Um, especially if you have a couple of the same species of trees in your yard. If you look around and you're observing these other trees, and say you have one next to it that's really looking bad, but the one its neighbor, which is the same tree, is looking perfectly healthy, there's a good chance that, okay, there's just something going on with that one tree. However, if the two neighbor trees of the same species both have similar symptoms, you may have something bigger going on that you want to look at. Maybe you have an insect infestation or some sort of problem like that. That's something you want to kind of explore a little bit more. So it's really important to kind of understand those signs and symptoms and what time of the year it is. Because when you think about tree health, it's not that complex, really. Again, if you know what your tree is supposed to look like when it's healthy, when you begin to look around, things that are a little off are going to just pop right out at you. And what you can see here, this picture is actually a sycamore tree, and you can see it's not looking that great. There's something going on one side of the tree. And when you look a little bit closer at the tree, hey, I see some leaves that are dead, but I also see some leaves that are healthy. What's going on here? It's kind of weird. That's where that last part there is the time of the year. Now, for this specific example, this is called sycamore anthracnose, which can happen in the spring during a real wet and cold spring. The sycamore tree actually will leaf out, but it gets quickly those young leaves and those real succulent branches actually kind of get attacked by anthracnose, which is a fungal disease, which is prevalent during wet, cold springs. But for the sycamore tree, typically it snaps right out of it. It kind of kicks in its auxiliary buds, and those are those green leaves you can see that are looking relatively fresh. So as soon as that season is gone, those auxiliary buds will grow, and the tree will continue on and do relatively well. So again, that's that time of year thing as well. Just, there's a couple things in play there. But knowing what your tree is supposed to look like is really important. So we're going to watch a video here about how to monitor and inspect your trees. So let me get that queued up. All right.
Hey everyone, Seth Hawkins, Community Forester with the Georgia Forestry Commission here. Welcome to another episode of our Ask the Arborist Tree Care video series. Today we're going to be talking about tree risk assessment in your backyard so you can start to understand what defects make a tree either risky or not as risky, and start to understand your mitigation options for tree risk you might have on your property. So we're going to look at a couple trees, talk about some common tree defects we see, talk about how that affects tree risk in your community and in your backyard. So we're here looking at this lovely swamp chestnut oak we got here. The tree looks healthy, the foliage all looks great and fine. There are, however, some defects that are pretty common tree defects on this tree that make it more likely to fail. So the first thing we'll look at is the root system. The one thing you'll notice here is just all these circling roots. These roots that are just wrapped around the root plate of this tree. Probably a function of soil compaction outside of that rooting zone. It's just easier for the roots to wrap around. The problem with that being is you kind of get all the weight of the tree kind of balanced on one central point. Trees really like to grow their roots way out and anchor themselves with a lot of surface tension outward. So when you have this issue with all these circling roots, that makes this tree much more susceptible to wind throw. And if you see mushroom growth like this at the base of your tree or anywhere right around the base in the root system, that's a pretty big red flag that there's fungal decay within the root system of this tree and in the stem of this tree. These mushrooms on the outside are the reproductive organ for the fungal decay that's inside the tree. But again, when you have fungus exposed around your root plate or right at the stem of your tree, it's a really big red flag that there's something going on inside the tree, again, making it more likely for failure. So we've established the defects in the root system of this tree and at the base of the tree that make it more susceptible to whole tree failure. After that, we start kind of moving up the tree, and we're going to start assessing the crown and the structural issues of the tree and looking for things that could make it more likely for partial tree failure or tree part failure. So the big thing that I see when I look at the structure of this tree is where we have these two co-dominant stems and that really tight branching angle right there. You have the formation of what we call included bark right here. So included bark has no structural integrity, it doesn't hold the tree together or anything. In fact, can serve as a spacer to push these two stems apart over time. You'll also notice if you look closely this crack that's running down from the start of that included bark down the stem. It's hard to know how exactly deep that crack goes, but that is kind of a red flag that we need to be paying attention to this co-dominant stem and union here. So as you can see, this tree we were just talking about and looking at all those defects actually make this tree pretty likely to fail in a high wind or a storm event. However, it's important to understand the concept of tree risk and needing a defective tree likely to fail coupled with target occupancy of that area. So as you can see around this tree, there's no structures, there's no parking spaces, there's no real target occupancy for this tree. So if this tree did fail, its only real targets would be other trees around it. So when you start talking about risk, you have to couple, again, those defects with that target occupancy and the value of those targets. So we're going to go look at another tree that also has some defects and has a little bit more target occupancy, so should result in a higher tree risk rating for that tree. So I wanted to talk about this tree just to show another example of a major tree defect. You can see we have a really bad fungal decay pocket in this big old water oak, which is kind of par for the course for them. They're not great compartmentalizers. So it's important to consider species when you're doing your tree risk assessments. The real main point I wanted to make with this tree, there's parking spots, people hang out in the shade a lot. So when you start considering that higher target occupancy rate than we had on the other tree, paired with this major tree defect here, this tree would actually come out with a much higher risk rating than the first tree we talked about, again, due to this defect and that higher target occupancy rate. Okay, y'all, so we've looked at some common tree defects that I as an arborist see commonly that can increase the likelihood of failure for trees. We've also talked about target occupancy rate and how that affects tree risk. For more information on these topics, please visit our website, gatrees.org. There's a lot of resources on tree risk and several other tree care topics. And also visit the Ask the Arborist webpage. You can submit questions and pictures about trees in your backyard so you can start to establish the amount of risk you might have there. So thanks for watching today, and we will see y'all in the next episode.
All right. So I like that video because it really does kind of go through and show a little bit about how to inspect a tree. And obviously this video was tied to hazard tree assessment, but the same process does apply to when you're looking at your tree just for general healthcare purposes. Again, what's jumping out at you, what's not quite right, what do you need to kind of look into a little bit more. And as he said, you start from kind of the top or from the bottom and work your way up, just seeing how the roots are doing. Or do you see any fungal activity? Do you see any cracks within the trunk? But also looking at the soil. As he mentioned, those circular roots were probably because of compacted soil. Those exposed roots is a sign, those circulating exposed roots is a sign of something going on that might need to be addressed. And again, the more compacted the soil, the less oxygen the roots are getting. So that's going to stress out the tree as well. Looking at the sunlight, how much sunlight is a tree getting? Is it being overgrown by other trees? That could have an impact on how well the tree is going to perform. And lastly, the water, making sure if it's a dry summer, more than likely your trees are probably going to look a little bit stressed. That's going to be par for the course. So making sure that they're getting the right amount of water is going to really help them a lot down the road. So we kind of talked about tree health. Now I want to talk about pruning trees. Pruning trees is extremely critical when they're young to make sure that they have a good form as they grow older. But whenever you prune a tree, I have here this question is why prune? And that's something I would like for who's ever attending or watching this video down the road to think about that. When you go out to prune your trees, why are you pruning your trees? You should have a reason to do it, not just to go out just to cut branches to cut branches. You should always have a reason as to why you're pruning. Now, there's a couple different techniques I want to kind of share about pruning and why you may be pruning your trees. You may be doing a cleaning. Now, a cleaning pruning is just what it says here. It's removing those dead, dying, diseased branches. They may be weakly attached or broken. Some of them may have low vigor because they're growing inside the crown of the tree and being shaded out by some of those other branches on the outside. That's perfectly acceptable. We want to get rid of those branches because they're not doing the tree any good. And as long as they're pruned correctly, the tree will be able to grow, compartmentalize that wound and grow around the pruning, and you'll never see it in a couple years. The next technique is raising. Raising the tree is a way of pruning that's going to remove those lower branches and provide that clearance. I talked a little bit ago about planting a real large tree next to your house and how those branches are eventually going to grow into your house or grow right above your house, and you may not want that. So you may have to do what's called a raising prune to raise those branches away from your building, away from your house, up from the sidewalk. The community I live in, I got a letter from the town. I had to raise my street trees so they're at least 15 feet from the road for the plow trucks to be able to effectively move through. There's also what's called reduction pruning, and that's basically a process and a method to prune to reduce the size of the tree. A lot of times this is done for utility clearance. Whenever you're driving down Boonsboro, down Main Street by the historical park, you'll definitely, if you look at those trees next to the sidewalk, you can see some major reduction pruning going on there. And the purpose of that is to maintain that clearance from the utility lines. And reducing density is another technique that's often commonly employed. And that's basically reducing density is for some of the species, like maples, for example. If you have a real large sugar maple or a real large healthy red maple, a lot of times in your yard, if it has a real wide crown, you're not going to get hardly any sunlight down to the grass that you may be trying to grow underneath it. So what you can do sometimes is this reduction and reducing the density. It's where you're removing some of the crown to try to lighten it up to get more light to be able to move through the canopy. And it may provide a little bit more sunlight down to the grass to at least allow the grass a chance to grow. But sometimes, depending on the tree, you can do this for aesthetic reasons. So there are a variety of reasons you could do a reduction in density. So I want to talk about proper pruning techniques, and I'm going to hit on this with a couple slides here because this is extremely critical for your trees. If they're pruned improperly, it can really set the tree back quite a ways. So what I want to show here is when we're looking at the hardwoods, the correct way to prune prune a branch is you really want to identify with that branch collar. You can see that on the left and the right of the hardwood image there, that when you prune a tree, you're pruning it across the edge of the branch collar. What happens oftentimes is people will basically what I call stub it out. So you go up to a branch and you just prune it wherever you want to prune it, and you're basically creating a stub. It can be anywhere from a stub can be just an inch past a branch collar up to a foot, whatever. And what's going to happen is the tree will never be able to grow around that wound until that branch stub, that stub, rots and falls off. And it could be years that you would end up with an open wound on the tree, allowing the opportunity for insects or different funguses to enter in to the end of that branch stub and infect the tree. By pruning it correctly and finding that branch collar and pruning it flush with the branch collar, that tree will probably callus around that wound within a couple of years, and it's going to seal off that from any sort of outside insect or infection from a fungus or whatever. The same thing is when we look at the conifers. Again, conifers have a branch collar as well. You want to identify where that branch collar is and then prune it right along that branch collar. The one thing you don't want to do as well is when you go up to a tree, you don't want to prune it completely flat against the trunk. What happens there is the branch collar is completely cut off. So the tree has got to reorganize its cells and then try to begin to create, compartmentalize, and slowly it's going to try to close off that wound. But again, you run into a situation where maybe say it takes a year or two to close off a small wound along a branch collar. If you cut the branch collar off, you'll probably set that tree back 5 to 6 years before it'll be able to completely close off that wound. As far as pruning tools, this should be relatively self-explanatory. When it's a small tree, some of the best things to use, if it's a small branch, say about a 1/2 inch or smaller, that's alive, you can easily use a hand pruner with bypass cutters that makes a nice clean cut, relatively simple. If it's a larger branch, you can use those loppers. Those work really well. A nice sharp handsaw is another good thing to kind of have in your bag of equipment, as well as a pole saw. That bottom one there is it's called a bow saw. Those are okay. Bow saws aren't quite as common. I mean, a lot of folks still have them. Most of the time I've seen them used is for cutting down Christmas trees. But if you need to use one of those to kind of do your pruning, by all means, if the saw is sharp, go for it. So as far as when should you prune? It really does depend on why you're doing your pruning. If you're doing light pruning and you're just removing some dead wood or maybe some crossing branches or something like that, it really doesn't matter. You can do that any time of the year. The tree will be grateful. But as rule of thumb, I want to go through a couple different types of pruning and when they should occur. So winter pruning, that's done during the dormancy. And this is ideally, especially for deciduous trees when the leaves are off the tree. This is really a great time to do it. You want to do it after the coldest time of the year. So I would say probably, ideally don't do it in January or early February. Late February through March is a wonderful time to prune your deciduous trees. The nice thing is it's going to allow that tree to have that, when the buds begin to break, when things begin to get warmer in the spring, the tree will easily compartmentalize that wound. It's going to immediately start healing. Well, I should say healing. It's going to begin callusing over the wound, and it's going to, and the growth and the energy that the tree was going to direct towards that branch that is now removed will get redirected pretty quickly to other branches. The next one is summer pruning. Summer pruning is typically done if you really want to slow the growth of the tree. So if you have a smaller tree, you're trying to kind of keep it a little bit, keep its size under control. That's when you want to do summer pruning. So after the tree leaves out and it gets some of that young growth, that's when you can kind of go in there with your hand pruners and just kind of snip it a little bit. That's going to really kind of help direct that tree. Because as soon as you have that new growth of a new stem in the new year, you cut that, it's not going to grow anymore. It'll probably branch out and go in 2 different directions if it continues growing. So that's a way you can kind of control the size of the tree. Now, I have a note here that for trees that bloom in the spring, obviously you want to prune after the flowers fade. Because if you prune a springtime flowering tree in the winter or early summer, you're going to prune off the flowers. So that's why you don't want to prune a dogwood or anything like that, because you don't want to cut off those flower buds. But if it flowers mid to late summer, then you can do it in the winter or early spring without damaging or running the risk of losing those flowers. So a note about when not to prune. We don't want to prune our trees in the fall. The reason being is in the fall, that's when all the leaves are dropping. A lot of times it can be wet, it can be cold on those leaves, especially if they had any sort of fungus on them. The spores are going to basically erupt and be available to kind of spread. And what's going to happen is when you prune in the fall, the tree's not going to begin any sort of compartmentalization of the wound or any growing of the callus over the wound until the following spring. So you have an open wound all season long for that may have the opportunity for a fungus to enter into the tree. So best to kind of put those saws away in the fall and just wait. That's because the trees at that point, they're not going to be growing, they're just kind of there. So again, I just want to kind of show this diagram of the proper pruning techniques and really just emphasize how critical it is to prune along the branch collar. And what this is showing here is you'll see there's a 1, 2, and a 3. And that's a sequence of when you're pruning a larger branch of how you want to make your cuts. You do a shallow cut, number 1, on the underside of the branch you're pruning, followed by the number 2 cut on the top of the branch past the number 1 cut, that first cut. And the reason you do that is if you just come in and cut, say from number 2 straight down, especially if it's in the spring or early summer when there's a lot of sap flowing up and down through the tree, that bark, as you cut straight down, that bark is going to, the branch is going to break and the bark is going to do what they call tear. It's not going to break away cleanly from the stub, and it's going to rip all the way down the trunk. Now, the downside of that is the tree now not only has not only does it have the wound at the branch collar to heal, it has that long strip of missing bark going down the trunk that it's got to recover and try to grow over as well. So in this technique, and I recommend, this is how I do it. You do the underside cut 1 first, followed a little bit further up. It could just be a 1/2 inch up on the branch. Cut number 2, that takes the branch down. You end up with a small little stub. That way, when you come back for your final cut, which is the 3rd cut there, you identify your branch collar and you go from the top to the bottom and you just cut along the branch collar and you're done. This diagram here has a lot going on, and I'm not going to really go into a ton of detail because we're going to watch a video here about how to prune. But again, as we talked about when you're pruning, that first question is, why are you pruning? This is really showing just some different examples of some branches you want to remove when you're coming up to a tree. You don't really know where to start. You need to kind of look at that tree and decide, what do I want to remove first? Ideally, you only want to remove, I try to remove no more than 25% of a tree's living branches in 1 year. They say you can go up to about a third. It's kind of a judgment call. So sometimes if the tree is really in bad shape, you just kind of need to prioritize that and take off maybe 25% this year and then come back and do some more corrective pruning the following year, maybe by coming back a 3rd year and finishing out what you really wanted to accomplish, getting the tree into the correct shape. But you can see here in this diagram, they have some crossed over branches. If the branches are rubbing, one of those should be removed. Dead branches should be taken off at that branch collar. If you see a branch that has a disease on it, or some sort of insect infestation or something like that, you can go ahead and take that off. Water sprouts are those little branches that grow up, kind of like they sucker out from a branch or from the trunk, you can take those out. Broken branches, you want to remove those because those could become a safety hazard down the road. And again, as that video we just saw talked about, a real weak V-shaped crotch that had that bark growing inside it. If it's a small tree and you have that going on, you can remove one of those branches and you won't have to deal with that down the road. So we're going to watch a video about proper pruning techniques.
Hi, my name's Pete Smith, and I'm a forester and an arborist for the Arbor Day Foundation. And we're here to talk today about winter pruning for some of our landscape trees. What I'm going to demonstrate today are what I call the ABCs of pruning. And the A stands for assess. So we're going to take a look at the tree and try to make some judgments about how healthy is the tree. Has it been growing at a fast pace or a slow pace? We're going to look at the setting that the tree is growing in. Is it in a place where people travel frequently? Or is it in a place where we can have a more natural form? And then we're going to talk about the species of the tree. We want to try to maximize the natural form that every species has. And we can do that through some of our pruning. One important step in assessing the tree as we move around it from side to side would be we want to find the central leader for the specimen. What is the branch that is going straight up through the center of the tree trying to reach the sky? So the B in our ABCs of pruning stands for bad branches. And by bad, we're talking about branches that are dead, or they're damaged in some way, or they may even be diseased. And we want to focus on those branches first as a priority for our pruning cycle on this particular tree. So one branch on this tree that we have that is very damaged is this branch right here, and it's competing with our main central leader that we've already established in this tree. And it's got some dead bark on one side. It's got a bad branch angle. So this is definitely a bad branch that we're going to want to remove. So finally, we have the C's in our ABCs of pruning. And that C stands for competing branches. Now you remember that we identified the central leader of the tree during our assessment. And we want to take a look at all the other branches that might be competing with that leader, and those become candidates for removal or reduction. So here's a situation where we do have a bad branch. This is where we have two branches that are actually in contact. So here's a situation where we're just going to remove this branch, and we're going to try to cut right outside the branch collar. So one of the branches that we identified early on, that's one of our bad branches, and we're going to go ahead and remove this right here. So now you can plainly see what remains is that central leader that we identified early on. That becomes the real focal point for this tree. Now the next step in this ABCs of pruning involves looking at our competing lateral branches. So here we have a branch that's coming off the trunk of the tree, and immediately the most vigorous part of this branch goes straight up and is actually trying to draw energy away from the central leader and create its own leader. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do another reduction cut on this competing lateral by taking off this particular portion of it above my hand and leaving what remains, and that'll slow down the growth of this particular branch. Now I've got one more competing lateral that I really want to try to diminish using one of our reduction cuts, because because this one is definitely competing with our central leader for this tree. So thanks for watching. And remember, if you have questions, let us know.
Okay, so that was a good video to kind of just see some of the different techniques that are used in pruning your trees. Now, I'm going to end the pruning topic here, just talking about bad pruning. And I talked about obviously not leaving a stub or completely removing the branch collar. But one thing I want to mention that's still unfortunately a common practice today is topping a tree. And that's basically removing the majority of the branches on the tree, creating this almost cactus looking thing. It's when you see it, it jumps out at you, especially when it's first done. It's a practice that was done years ago, before people really understood the true biology of trees and how they grow, and how they respond to pruning. What's going to happen to a tree like this is it will sucker out. If the tree is healthy enough, it will sucker out at the along the wound by the wounds with the auxiliary buds that are just underneath the bark, and you'll end up with this like pom-pom looking tree. The downside is these wounds that were inflicted on this tree will never completely callus over. The tree won't. It can't. And you're going to end up with rot being introduced into each of the ends of these branches. And the tree, as it grows, it may look someday like a normal tree, but you're going to have these clubs. You can actually look at it in the fall and winter and see where those original topping cuts were laid out, and there's going to be rot inside those. Oftentimes they're hollow at that spot. We got a real quick little video here that I want to show you. Just talks about the negativity of topping trees and how bad it can really be for trees, and that it's just a bad practice.
Next month, can you believe it? But experts say now is the perfect time to start landscaping your trees. Scarlett Lizjak breaks down one common practice that does more harm than good.
Experts say that this time of year is when many people usually get out their gardening shears.
This is the perfect time of the year to prune most things, late winter, early spring.
Clemson Extension Office horticulture agent Drew Jeffers says there are different methods to groom your trees, but one popular practice is actually harmful.
If I had to sum it up in one sentence, tree topping is a sin.
Topping a tree is when you make large cuts to central branches.
Tree topping is a procedure that is done mistakenly to manage height of trees. You see it a lot of times with crepe myrtles. They literally come in and say, I want these trees that are now 15 feet tall, we're going to knock them down to 4 feet or 5 feet, whatever it is. They come in and they literally draw an imaginary line and they cut everything off, leaving nothing but stumps.
This practice can be detrimental to the tree's lifespan.
You get a lot of moisture on those cuts, and you can actually get a lot of rot and disease going into the tree. It weakens the tree over time, especially with like crepe myrtles. The more and more it's done, the weaker and weaker and weaker the tree gets.
Jeffers says the best thing to do is to prune, which focuses on strategically taking off smaller branches.
Anytime we do pruning, we always want to have a goal in mind. So if it's growing too much in one direction, say toward a house or something like that, that's when we prune it and push the energy toward the other direction.
Jeffers says that managing your tree's height starts before it's planted into the ground.
We talk about managing height from the beginning when you're picking out your trees. Example, I wouldn't put an oak tree or a maple tree underneath the power line just because it's going to grow very tall and it's going to be eventually need to be taken out.
The Clemson Extension Office says they have posts on their website giving you details on how to prune your trees, but if you still have questions, they say to give their office a call. In Spartanburg, Scarlett Lizjak, 7 News.
And the Extension Office also recommends that before you have any work done on your trees, to contact an ISA certified arborist. We'll have all that information on WSPA.com.
One of the great challenges in this world is knowing.
All right. Let's see here. There we go. Back to the presentation. So yes, topping trees, it's a practice that's been around for a long time, but it's probably one of the worst practices that you can possibly do to a tree. So if you have a tree that needs major pruning, as I said in this video, and I would endorse that, contact a arborist, preferably somebody who is what they call a certified arborist by the International Society of Arboriculture. They've tested and have a baseline level of understanding about trees and their biology and correct pruning techniques. So, all right, we're going to talk a little bit about invasive insects before we end our presentation. So some of the common pests, I'm going to hit mostly on some really highly invasive insects that we've seen in this area. The first one is the emerald ash borer. This little insect came in on wood packing material from Asia back in 2002. It was first found in the Detroit area. It only attacks ash trees, and it's really pretty much killed the majority of the ash trees in this area and pretty much the northeastern United States. It's a relatively quick spreader. It can move on its own, 5 to 10 miles a year on a natural spread. The damage of this insect, the adult, is this metallic green beetle, which is about the size of a .22 caliber rifle bullet, relatively small. The adult beetle doesn't do the damage. The damage is done by the larva. So it'll lay an egg on the outside of the tree after the females mate, and the larva will bore into the tree, and under the bark of the tree, they'll create these S-shaped bore pattern. And what's happening is, as we talked about early on about the tree anatomy, that cambium and phloem layer is where they feed. And basically what they're boring through is that cambium and phloem layer. So as one insect isn't going to really hurt the tree. One larva won't hurt a tree, but when when the tree is infested with hundreds or sometimes thousands of larvae, the tree will eventually basically become strangled, and the plumbing, the network of ducts that move nutrients up and down from the root system to the canopy is blocked, and the tree dies. The next insect I want to kind of share about is gypsy moth. Gypsy moth is a little bit different. Again, the adults don't really do the damage. Gypsy moth is found in northeast United States. We have gypsy moth in this area. The damage is done in the early summer after the adult, basically there's egg masses that overwinter on the trees, or anywhere really for that matter, where the adult female lays the egg mass. The eggs will hatch, and Lepidoptera larvae, the little caterpillars, will march out and begin feeding. And their damage is done differently versus the emerald ash borer, where it's done on the inside of the tree. Gypsy moth, the larvae feed on the leaves. They're what's called a defoliator, and they will defoliate. When you have a heavy enough infestation, they love oak trees, and if you have an oak forest and a heavy gypsy moth infestation, they can completely strip all of the leaves off of the trees. And that's where it'll, over a course of a couple of years, if that happens repeatedly, the oak tree will eventually become stressed. The first year, more stressed the second year, and by the third year, whatever it was able to put out, it just gives up and it'll die. So they can actually kill trees through repeated defoliation. The next insect is one which is more of an ornamental pest, but it's kind of a nuisance, which is Japanese beetle. Again, they kind of hit us. Their damage is done not only on the adults, where they're feeding can get really heavy on certain plants, and they can completely strip a linden tree of the green matter. They'll feed on the leaves and strip out the leaves, or a crepe myrtle. They like crepe myrtle, your roses as well. The adults are quite the nuisance. But the other side for them is they're also a nuisance in the immature as a grub. Their life cycle basically runs to where the adults will come out during June, July, and August. In August, the adults will mate. The females will lay their eggs inside the grass thatch layer. Those eggs will hatch, and then over the course of the fall, winter, and early spring, they will feed on the root system of the grasses. So they're basically a grub. So again, one of those things that's really difficult to control. The best thing to do sometimes is using a grub control on your yard to kind of control those grubs. And if you do that, you're not going to get as many of the adults to emerge. Again, we talked about this one early on, which is sycamore anthracnose. I put this one in the slide just because of our trees in Schaefer Park. Oftentimes, we have those beautiful large sycamore trees in Schaefer Park. Sometimes when we have that cold, wet spring, you look up, especially about this time of year, you'd be like, what's wrong with the trees? And it's probably they got a taste of the sycamore anthracnose. Those trees are been around for a long time. They will snap out of it. But sycamores are often a pretty common tree around here, but I just wanted to kind of point that one out. The last insect I really wanted to kind of share is a new one, which is that spotted lanternfly. This one was found around the Philadelphia area and has slowly been moving out. I think it was first found around 2012, 13, 14, right around there. It's an invasive from Asia. It's a relatively pretty one. I'm sure everybody's heard of this one. It feeds on grapes. It has a huge host list of what it'll feed on. The adults, it's actually in the leaf hopper family. And the adults, the big thing they say right now is you see it, kill it. And that's definitely the best approach to take. But they can actually swarm and get really bad as a nuisance. Quite a nuisance pest. Again, as far as here in Maryland, this is from the Maryland Department of Agriculture showing the spotted lanternfly in quarantine. You can see that it's pretty much in every county except down by Ocean City, Salisbury, and down St. Mary's County. I guess they haven't found it down there yet, but pretty much the rest of Maryland, you're going to find the spotted lanternfly. It can be moved. It moves on its own because it does fly a little. It's not a strong flyer, but the biggest thing is we're the ones that are moving it around. Typically it can be moved on firewood. Egg masses can be moved on outdoor equipment, on RVs, things along those lines. But as far as what it can feed on, it has a pretty wide host list. Anything from grape, maples, pines, black cherry, again, sycamore. But that bottom one I wanted to point out is that tree of heaven. And that's listed as a primary host for the spotted lanternfly. And it's interesting, some of the research that I've done about spotted lanternfly is there's something that has to do, because tree of heaven is an invasive tree species that's introduced into North America. It's not native to here. It's actually native to the area where the spotted lanternfly is from. And the spotted lanternfly will need to feed on the tree of heaven at some point during its life in order to successfully mate and complete its life cycle. So one thing I would recommend to folks, if you have a lot of tree of heaven, excuse me, plants in your yard or trees growing, and you're able to remove them, I would highly recommend it. I had my neighbor here had a tree of heaven that was just on the other side of the fence. They recently took it down, but I'm now dealing with all of the little prodigy of that tree of heaven that's been growing in my backyard. So I've been going around trying to remove. Whenever I see one, I clip it. And I actually have a stump killer that I bought off of Amazon that I'll just kind of paint. I'll clip the seedling and just paint that, because the one thing about tree of heavens is they are very prolific. As far as if you cut it, it'll sprout right back up multiple times. So you really almost need to use that kind of herbicide to kill the root just to get rid of the tree completely. But if you remove all the tree of heavens from your area, from your yard, from your landscape, you're really going to reduce that spotted lanternfly pressure, because they are highly attracted to that tree of heaven. So the more you're able to kind of remove those, the lower the pressure, probably the fewer spotted lanternflies you're going to be dealing with. Again, just to kind of talk about how to control it. They do have a mechanical control. There's, if you get on the Maryland Department of Agriculture website, you can kind of see about some homemade traps you can make yourself. This is the egg mass. This is an image of the egg mass. It's kind of a, looks like a gypsy moth egg mass, but it's a little bit more kind of light brown dirt looking thing on the trunks. If you go out like during the winter around Tree of Heavens, you'll probably definitely see those. If you see any of those in your yard, you can scrape them off and just crush the eggs that are underneath it. That'll eliminate that egg mass. The more of those you can eliminate, again, the fewer hatches you're going to have. There's chemical controls that you can use with insecticide, but again, I'd recommend hiring a professional for that. And as far as cultural controls, that's what I talked about. You know, if you have trees of heaven on your property, removing those will definitely reduce the amount that you're going to be dealing with on a reoccurring basis, because they won't be attracted probably to hopefully much of your other landscape. So the last slide I have is who to call and when. And within the Boonsboro, we do on the town website have an urban forestry page. We have a lot of useful, helpful links that you can access there. But I would say it probably depends on what your situation is. You know, if you see something, if you're out and about in Schaefer Park and you see something with one of the trees, by all means call town hall. If it's on your own property and you're not quite sure what to do, if you see something not quite right, you can reach out to the University of Maryland Extension Forest here in Washington County. They do have volunteer master gardeners that you could probably talk with and contact. If your tree has a sort of a disease or something like that, you think, or if they have a recommendation of getting it sent off to be tested, the University of Maryland Extension does have a plant clinic that they can send off specimens to kind of get evaluated. And again, you can always reach out to, you know, there's a variety of arborists in the area. You know, again, I would just recommend that ideally that they would be what's called a certified arborist through the International Society of Arboriculture. And specifically here in Maryland, they have to be a licensed tree care worker. That's managed through the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. So that's a basic certification I would always highly recommend. And if they do work on your property, make sure they're insured. So with that, I am going to end the recording and thank you for being here.